everybody, wherever you're dialing in from. Welcome to the Sydney Behavioural Economics Behavioural Science Network talk. I'm Will Mailer, and my co-host today is Aaron Child, who will join shortly for Q&A. I'll introduce our speaker shortly, but I just wanted to give a really big thank you to our new sponsor. So the UTS University, really big thank you for your support with the network. UTS are leaders in behavioural science and behavioural economics, education and thought leadership. And keep your eye out for some new format events and some new speakers from the UTS network. We're really excited to partner with UTS. Thank you, guys. Hashtag today, if you want to follow on Twitter, is hashtag BenSyd, BEN caps SYD. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Elena Hallinan, joining us from Holland. I think it's a respectable hour. It's about 8 in the morning, I think. We can see the morning sun coming through. Elena is an expert in behavioural insights and strategy with a really interesting background in cultural psychology. Roughly 15 years experience in kind of working across industries and with lots of different companies. Today, Elena's going to talk about the COM-B model and how we can use this as a kind of a structure to understand where are the most important places for us to focus when we are trying to change behaviour and to be most effective. I've spoken to Elena about this topic before, and she's got a really good hold of this model and some really fascinating insights. So I'll pass to Elena now, and Aaron's going to host some Q&A at the close of the session. But thanks everyone for joining. Over to you, Elena. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so I feel like I kind of feel like I've accidentally become an evangelist for the COM-B model and behavior change wheel, the sort of commercial sector and elsewhere. It started a little bit accidentally. I've been using COM-B for 6-7 years now. I've kind of forgotten when I first heard about it, but or started using it. But I've used it sort of in my use of it has increased in steps. I first just used the simplest parts of COM-B, and then in the past couple of years, I've really sort of understood the full benefits of using it to structure my thinking and structure my work. When I discovered more about the theoretical domains framework and really how to use it, use the full behavior change wheel, which is what it's a part of. And but the challenge is that it was originally developed for public health, and that's why a lot of people hadn't heard of it until very recently. There was a very good book by Amy Bucher who wrote it. It was using it more in a user experience context, and that really started people people started to know about it more because she talked about it a lot. And then last year I put out a little call on LinkedIn to say, hey, is anyone else using COM-B? I'm open to having I'd really like to chat to people. And it was probably to my huge surprise, it was the most viral post I've ever put on LinkedIn. And because I thought it was just maybe 5 people would be interested, and suddenly it's like lots of people want to hear about it. And yeah, and I've ended up doing, I'm not, I didn't create it, but I'm really like using it, and I think it has the potential to be something that, if not quite a unifying theory for behavioral science, but at least some sort of grammar that we can use, and we can understand each other, practitioners and academics in different places, and create this kind of common language. So that's how I ended up talking about this. And yeah, so that's a brief intro to how I've ended up talking about this today. Because I don't know exactly who is here today, there we go. Just to put things into context, what we usually know as behavioral economics is mostly based on a discipline called judgment decision-making psychology, which itself draws on other disciplines. But actually, behavior change is a lot more than that. There's a lot more that goes into, if you want to change people's behavior than just behavioral economics with quotation marks, because the exact definition varies. But so that's how it all fits in, that there's a whole lot more that you can bring into that process. And that's really where I this is how I position behavior change for when I talk to clients. And the reason that COM-B is very is very handy, I think, is that when we talk about nudges and choice architecture and things like that, it's kind of focused on the immediate set of choices available to someone or to the person making a decision, and then kind of trying to help them overcome the things that might stand in the way of making better decisions. Now, that is one way of looking at it. It's very atomistic, it's very sort of particular, like looking at that very sort of snapshot of a moment. But every behavioral challenges or challenging behavior, or whatever we want to call it, it's a causal structure that goes way, way, way beyond that immediate choice architecture and choice situation. And if you don't analyze a problem, the problem in its environment, it kind of limits how much impact your intervention will make. And then so thinking about the wider, zooming out a little bit and taking a broader perspective can be super helpful in identifying starting points for interventions and tailoring them to the problem. And there's a lot more, there's a really good paper about this whole thing of how, for example, behavior change can fail. It's on my blog, but it's a summary of Magda Osman's paper. So if you want to read that, I highly recommend it. It's the 8 ways are, it's good to keep in mind. But that's just kind of like why think about the broader context, because there are so many ways that behavior change can fail, even though we don't talk about it a lot. But logic models can really help with this, and it can help in a kind of a sort of relatively easy and structured way. I'll come back to explain what logic model is if you don't know that yet. But just sort of, to tease your I don't know, intellectual appetite, why COM-B is your new best friend is really, or why I believe it should be your new best friend, is that it's kind of a tip of a, not an iceberg, but maybe this nice kind of triangle, that at the top, very top, you have quite a simple, if not simplistic, but simple way of explaining what really comprises, like what a behavior is comprised of. And that's really everyone has to have the capability, opportunity and motivation to do something. And then they do the behavior that we're interested in. But that's kind of just the, tip. And then underneath it, there's this whole, that's a conversation that you can easily have with, stakeholders. You can explain it to your mum, so it kind of passes the mum test. And but underneath it, there is a huge amount of tools and detail that we can use. The more experienced you get, you can almost, like, if you're only getting started in behavioral science or behavior change, you can easily stick to the COM-B, and that's, you're good. It's still helpful, but the more experienced you get, the more you can dive into, kind of gradually ease your way into all this other nuance and detail. And that's why it really has that longevity as well, that if you need the granularity, if you want that support, it's there. It's all sort of, it's kind of like, if you understand the COM-B model, it's a bit like, how to drive a car. You understand that, pressing the accelerator and brake and blah, 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 but you don't necessarily need, in order to drive a car, you don't really need to understand how the engine works. And kind of everything that's under that, the 3 underlying triangles are kind of like how the car actually moves. But the top bit is what you need to know to sort of drive the car. So that's really that's the behavior change wheel. And then you've got, that's a short, quick illustration of theoretical domains framework. I'll show you about that. And then you've also got these behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action. And I'll be completely honest, so far, we're not yet at the maturity level in the commercial sector I've ever needed to actually go to the detail of using the BCTs or the mechanisms of action. But, hopefully, the more we talk about this, we'll get there. And so before I kind of jump into all of this, I don't usually mention all this stuff about logic model, but because this is quite a sophisticated audience, I thought I'll mention that too, because logic model, the term was new to me, even though I knew COM-B and knew behavior change wheel. So logic model, this is not something we often talk about in behavioral economics or behavior change, but it comes from public policy and kind of implementation science. And that's not usually an area we look for, read the literature, read the papers. So I think it's a really interesting and a very useful concept for us to learn about. And so logic models, they kind of define it's really kind of way of defining a problem and then the solutions and link them all together. So with the behavior change wheel, which is the, where COM-B sits, is that you start from defining or diagnosing the behavioral challenge, and then you kind of move on through structured steps to the actual interventions, and then how you deliver them as well. So it's kind of like your guidelines, your safeguards that keep you on track. And that's really, it's very, very helpful to, there are a couple of real benefits for logic models in general. There are other benefits to specifically to COM-B using that. But for a logic model, it helps to kind of, you can test the logic behind your behavior change program to first and ensure that you didn't overlook anything, but also use that to, you can use it to sort of create hypotheses and kind of make sure that your own thinking is more rigorous, that you've actually thought of everything, and and have you really thought through that, here's the behavioral challenge, how is the intervention going to link to that. But it also helps create, if you have a lot of stakeholders who are not experts in behavioral science, which they usually are not, then you can help them feel like they understand what you're doing and understand the logic behind the whole the implementation program, really. And it helps to keep everyone on track. And it at any stage of the process, you can kind of look back and go, right, is what we're doing, does that make sense relative to the problem that we're trying to solve? And really helps to safeguard against behavior change programs, the interventions failing. Of course, there's 101 ways that it could go wrong, and it's all in the detail. But that's all the more reason to have something to keep us on track. And so with that intro, I'm going to tell you more about the COM-B. So COM-B is the core of the behavior change wheel, and the behavior change wheel was developed from 19 frameworks of behavior change by the UCL behavior change department. And basically the green center identifies the sources of behavior that could be the targets of intervention. Typically, you'll talk about them as barriers, but actually that's kind of the official use of those of the COM-B. But there's nothing stopping you from actually thinking what could be also drivers of behavior, and like contrasting different subgroups and so on. So you can use it that way to kind of stimulate your thinking. And then around the green hub, or the core of the wheel, is 9 intervention functions that you can choose from, depending on your COM-B analysis and what you think the problem is. And then the outer wheel, or the rim, identifies delivery categories that can support the intervention functions. Now, some of these, if you work in a commercial sector, some of them won't be available to you, but that doesn't mean that you can't use the COM-B anyway. It's in reality, probably none of the, in no situation do you have every possible option at your disposal, because there's also cost and feasibility and so on, and all sorts of other reasons. So even if you work in public policy, where this was developed for, you probably still don't always have all those options available. So, yeah, that's really the COM-B. And it's not, some people kind of criticize COM-B sometimes, that it's too prescriptive, and it doesn't take into account creativity and blah 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 blah. Well, to me, it's like, it's not meant to be a detailed blueprint for designing the interventions. You still have to do all that work towards the end of the or in some of the stages, but it gives us a systematic and kind of theoretically guided method for identifying types of interventions that would be expected to work in a given a certain target behavior. And it starts from that behavioral analysis to the problem, then what needs to change, and then linking that to the functions and the behavior change techniques. The behavior change techniques will come in also at the later stage, but it's not a magic bullet that will just like spit out like a computer says, bloop, here you go, what will work, and kind of spit it out. It's a method. You need to think of it as a method of finding out what might work, and more like, I tend to think of it as like these days more like grammar of behavior change or behavioral science, that it helps you structure your own thinking. And I mean, if you need to document your work in a very sort of strict way. If you happen to work in policy or if you're writing a paper, then sure, work very strictly, as is necessary within the the actual behavior change wheel. But if you work in a commercial sector, you can take a bit more creativity and kind of use it just as a support rather than very strictly. And because it's also sort of this is a question that comes up often, like what's the difference between like Mindspace and East and COM-B. Now, Mindspace and East are more to do with the intervention design, and whereas behavior change wheel and COM-B model are about diagnosing behavior and guiding the process itself. And you can still, use Mindspace and East in tandem with COM-B, but they just come in a little bit towards, in the implementation stages. But they are very, very different things. Mindspace and East were not meant to be logic models. They are sort of like just, a mixed bag of constructs and things that helped make behavioral science and behavior change easier for policymakers and other stakeholders to understand. So they're really, they're kind of a bit different. But there's an actual whole white paper on this, or explainer on the unlockingbehaviorchange.com website. And I've got some of those links at the end as well. And yeah, so really, I've kind of sort of mentioned this already, but COM-B is one of the really, really big advantages that it can help you organize knowledge, your knowledge about the situation, the behavior, and review all the factors that might be relevant. You can debias your own thinking, because let's face it, we're all slightly prisoners of our own experiences and what we think has worked and what we've done. That's totally fine. We know that that's normal and we're just only human, but it's useful to have something like this to kind of really check yourself. And let's say that you are creating hypotheses, you're at very, very early stages of a project, and you're trying to think of like, okay, so what could be the barriers here? You can start with like what comes to mind, and then once you've done your sort of brain dump, you can then use the six sort of COM-B dimensions to kind of go, okay, where do they fall, and then where are their gaps? And then you can go like, oh yes, I hadn't thought of that before, or let's see, are we really sure that there's nothing in the physical environment that might be doing this, or blah blah blah. So you can use that to kind of check yourself. And if you have research projects, or if you have other types of projects, you can kind of create continuity between them. But the important thing to kind of note about COM-B and the behavior change wheel is that it helps you structure your thinking, but it is not a substitute for actually understanding psychological principles or research findings and so on, because without that background knowledge, it's kind of just like someone put it on LinkedIn very, very wisely, that is kind of just a bunch of semi-useful folder headers. And that is true, but it's I think it's still really, really useful, and it helps create this continuity. Now, this is something that I once had to sort of like quickly explain in a client presentation, because they were curious, like, what about behavioral economics? This is not a conclusive list, but I sort of went through this little exercise of like, does COM-B actually cover everything? And I think it does. It covers a bunch of stuff, most things that you might want to talk about under the umbrella term behavioral economics, and it covers more things that we don't necessarily talk about in that context. Well, not exhaustive list at all, but just to show you that it actually, you can also, this is another way you can use COM-B to kind of organize your thinking, like, where does this fall, and and so on. And so the COM-B, what it's for, it's to identify barriers to behavior, and it kind of helps us do that in a systematic way in situations where usually the problems that require behavior change are not ones that are easy to, like, straightforward to solve. If they were, it wouldn't be a problem. It wouldn't be a problem that comes to us as a project, as practitioners. And so you might have lots of different behaviors, you might have different people groups, stakeholders, and those things also interact. So this can help us a bit, untangle those. And the core idea of COM-B is that for an individual to do a behavior, they have to have the capability, opportunity, and motivation to do it. And here the motivation is in the middle, because capability and opportunity both influence motivation, but it's it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as as an acronym that's COMP. So, and these three dimensions, they split further into two sub-dimensions. So capability is both physical and psychological, opportunity is physical and social, and then motivation is automatic and reflective. I'll go through those as well. So capability is really what's on the the capacity and abilities that an individual has. So it could be their physique, could be their like physical ability to do something, like do you have enough strength or or dexterity, but also also their knowledge, their intellectual capacity, skills, and things like that. Could also, what falls under this is sort of memory processes, attention, all that kind of stuff. That's all falls into here, and they're usually solved by improving someone's understanding of how to do something, and or why, reminders, memory aids, and then things like developing skills. And then opportunity is really the the environment that is around us and people interact with. It can be the physical environment, or it can be the social environment. And so these are usually either the physical environment, could be the choice architecture, but it could also be the financial and material resources someone has. So like having enough time, or having enough time or money to do something. But these are not necessarily always if you're thinking strictly in terms of behavioral, like what you'd see under behavioral economics, you wouldn't necessarily think of those because they're not psychological factors, they're quite tangible factors. And what I really like about Combi is that it helps to have that conversation with stakeholders that, if someone doesn't, it's not a problem to be solved with psychological tools. If someone does not have the time or money to do something, but it is something that something that we need to take into account. Maybe maybe it rules out one target audience, for example. So even if it's not something it's not a psychological problem, we still need to know about it. And then social environment, you can solve some of those sometimes by boosting social cues or other things, or sort of fostering and harnessing different norms, or just being aware of them. That's quite useful, quite important as well. And then motivation is really kind of the sort of the spark or the engine of, well, I suppose that would be, if you think of it as, if you think of it as like a car analogy in some ways, the capability is kind of, I suppose, how the car is built and so on. But the motivation is really the, the fuel and what gets people moving. And a lot of stuff falls under, this is kind of the biggest category, biggest dimension in some ways, and the most complex, because it falls, a lot of things fall into it. Intentions, desires, evaluations, attitudes, opinions, beliefs, everything, and habits, and even habits fall into this in some ways. Well, they do, and this doesn't even begin to cover all the ways in which you can address motivation barriers, but mostly it's things like these, like you can create expectations or relief. Or forming and breaking routines, or harnessing, shaping values and identity, and better plans. But there's a whole lot that is in that. And then what is really sort of cool and also challenging is that the components of behavior interact. So if you imagine that if you have a piano at home, you'll practice more. So physical opportunity leads to increased psychological capability. But the more you practice, the better you get, the easier the practice is. So, then you're inspired to play more, because the harder something is, the less we want to do it, because it's just, and then, so physical capability, your fingers, also physical and psychological capability leads to increased motivation. But then on the other hand, if you're a teenager, playing the piano might be, uncool. So social opportunity decreases motivation. And really, sometimes it's useful to think about this as steps. So let's say I had a project recently where the client really, they were kind of, I was asked to come on board as a sort of the behavioral science expert, and they were hoping for a sort of a cool psychological solution to the behavior change challenge they had. But actually, it was really, the first step was to increase awareness and increase, help people understand why they should do something. And that's not quite as sexy nudge thing, but it's like there's no way you can actually, there's no point in you can't nudge people to do something when they don't really know why they should be doing it. And this was not a simple, straightforward behavior to change. So, and it almost seemed a little bit disappointing, but like, this is how you need to think about it. In this case, you need to increase the knowledge or the psychological capability first before you can even think about boosting their motivation. And you have to think of it in steps. So it can be helpful to think of it as like, how does the process, or how does the behavior, how does that form? And so this is kind of like just a quick peek under the hood, that underneath all of this, you have the theoretical domains framework, which is, there's a little bit more to it, but this is like a visualization of what sits underneath it. And it can really help you work out like, what is it exactly? Because, capability, knowledge, and memory, attention, decision-making processes are not the same thing. So when something falls under capability, it can still be helpful to kind of like, but what kind of capability issue is it? Because you'll solve it differently. Of course, you don't solve an awareness or understanding problem the same way as you would memory or attention problem. So, reminders are no good if you don't know why you should do something, for example, and vice versa. So it doesn't matter if you know how to do something if you forget. So the solution depends on that. But in order to actually use this, you need to have a lot of behavioral science knowledge. But what it can do, even for those who use it, is that you can use this very quickly, kind of like, is it this? Check, or you can use it in analysis, for example, analysis of transcripts and whatnot. But you can then narrow your kind of your search for solutions and for more details and more theory, for example, in one category. So if you're, let's say that you realize that it's an attitude problem. Now, attitudes are not one thing. There are several books about, how to change attitudes and the types of attitudes and everything to do with them. So it would be, you can't really say that it's just one, you've got the answer. There's a lot more to each of these categories. Of course there is. So it can help us simplify the process and kind of really make the process more efficient. There's also, you can use something like this, like how to choose the barriers you want to address, because there's a lot to, you need to kind of make it more feasible for yourself. So there's this list is actually from Amy Duker's book, which I highly recommend. It's very well written and sort of a very nice, accessible intro to behavior to COM-B, as opposed to the actual COM-B book, which is very much more technical and for public sector. So these are, you'll have these slides afterwards, I think, in a recording. So some of the things that you can think about when you're choosing barriers, it's like how many people, how often, what impact will changing the, or addressing the barrier have, and is it feasible and cost effective to actually do something. There are also other things in the behavior change wheel, like appease criteria, but I'll leave that for now because that's a lot more to do with public policy. But yeah, there's more to that as well. And then I often talk about using COM-B in research, but it is kind of meant for the diagnosis. So whether or not you do, you might have research that existing research that you mine and kind of review that and audit, or you might do some new research. So we'll start from that assumption today. So you can use it in a diagnosis, diagnosing the problem, that you can ask certain things if you're interviewing people, like people who are a target audience, or you can read transcripts, you can do whatever it is that you do to diagnose a problem. Certain things you can watch out for. These are from the Behavior Change Wheel book, so they're all in there, and I may have a slide on this as well, maybe, or I can put it in when I share the slides. And then the next step is that you match that with the solution types, and there's this kind of this grid is from the book as well, and then you design interventions to match. So there's a bit more detail on how you can see that. Basically, you can, let's say that you realize that, or you define that your your behavioral challenge. The barriers are mainly in our psychological capability, and then let's say reflective motivation, so awareness and attitudes or something like that. So to address awareness, education is very useful, and it also, education helps target both. But you can also let's see, if your problem is that you don't know why you should do something, will training help? Maybe, maybe not. But you can kind of just look through the the horizontally or vertically, where you feel like what types of intervention might be helpful. And here, this is where having the theoretical domains framework is very helpful, because if your psychological capability barrier was to do with knowledge, or was to do with memory or attention, then maybe something like enablement, which is basically anything that doesn't fit into education or training and so on, is kind of making things easier. There you might see that box might include things like memory aids or reminders and so on. So you can really see that there's so much depth to this, and it can really help you structure your thinking. You don't need to start from scratch, and you can really lean on this to spark, and kind of release more energy for your creativity, I suppose, to think about the solutions and not try to reinvent the wheel every time. And it's kind of, at the same time, it's very detailed, but at the same time very loose, that you can put your own thinking into it, and it'll keep you on track, but it doesn't restrict you. It will flex to, like, the COB model and the behavior change wheel will really flex from all sorts of target behaviors. I've used it from like EV, like electric vehicle drivers, their charging behavior and so on, to all the way to, thinking about challenging dog behaviors. And that's not an official use of it. That's just something I've started to use COMBI to really think through almost everything in my life. It becomes a way of thinking. And then the interventions, then the next step is you can think about, well, how do you, delivery options and kind of like executions. So I won't go into that, because there's a whole lot of options. That's really the message here, that there's lots of different ways to kind of deliver it. And here is where you can bring in things like mind, space, and ease, and a whole bunch of other things, because the devil is really in the detail of how you deliver something, to deliver an intervention. So it can still go wrong here, and here is where a lot of behavioral design and that kind of detail is required for you to kind of like really create an impactful intervention. And so, just as a sort of a reference for you, these are the types of things. Like education is increasing knowledge and understanding. There's persuasion, incentivization, and all sorts of other stuff. So you can use this as a kind of like, again, a guideline of how to design your implementation program, I suppose. And so there are lots, I've kind of included these, so you will have them, and you don't have to go and dig them out. I'll share the slides afterwards, that you can think very quickly, even if let's say that you are in a meeting with some stakeholders, and someone brings you a new challenge, like, well, we don't know people are doing this, we don't want them to do this, and blah, blah, whatever it is. You can very quickly think. You don't have to have the whole framework to hand. You can just think about a couple of things quickly, like, well, capability. Are people aware of why they should do this? Do they remember? Are they multitasking, distracted, something like that? Do they have plans or intentions? So, and you can kind of quickly think through, what do I know about the situation? What do I know about this behavior? And it can help you, in those conversations or wherever it is. So it's really, there's this simplicity and kind of this, I suppose, versatility, but also the detail that we've seen. And it's just to kind of like show you that there are different ways to solve this. So if you know that it's a memory issue, then communications or reminders can help that. If people are not aware, excuse me, of the benefits, then communication is going to really help with that. But then if that is not the problem, if it's if it's something to do with using the product or so on, then a product or service, then you may need to think about that. It could be financial products, it could be, it could be anything. Even with financial products, you do have product development and a kind of service provision and so on. So these are you can kind of think about which department, or in a bigger company, for example, which department would I need to talk to? Who's who holds the keys to the solution? And then for opportunity or the environment, sometimes when sometimes it's kind of tempting to that, especially well, the reason I've got this on my slides as well is that often communication and marketing department is kind of the person paying for the research project. So I often talk about this. And it's very tempting that, if we just have a campaign or blah, 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 some comms, a lot of things, if there is something about the physical situation, the solution is going to be a lot more complicated and probably a lot more expensive than just a campaign. I mean, sure, you can do that. Maybe it will make a difference, maybe it won't. But if if it's genuinely really difficult physically for people to do something, you can tell them all about it and they won't do it. So you've just kind of wasted your money. And if there are strong social norms, that's another thing. You might be able to address that with comms, but at the same time, you may need to, manage your stakeholders' expectations that it may take some time and you need a more long-term approach. And then for motivation, these are really, really tricky to change depending on what it is. But I mean, some might be easier, like incentivizing or things like that to make it. But incentivizing is sometimes actually addressing a physical opportunity problem and not really the motivation. But yeah, so they are difficult and time consuming to change sometimes. But if you improve capability and opportunity, that can help influence motivation. So when I said before that if you make something easier for people to do, the change of physical opportunity, boop, that can help. That can be your first step. That can help move the needle a little bit. If you improve their awareness or their knowledge of how to do something or why to do something, that can also help improve the motivation by proxy because they're connected. But you're not necessarily directly addressing the motivation. And then just some examples. I'm kind of aware of the time as well, so we can have more time to chat. So applying the call me is this is kind of, I laughed when I saw that somewhere. It's like, that is, your plan is going to be exactly like that. The way the book talks about it, all the materials that you'll ever see will make it seem like it's straightforward and, A to B and straightforward, smooth sailing. But in reality, it is going to be much more like the bottom picture, in my experience, that, it's like, yeah, this seems very straightforward until you get stuck in and suddenly, for example, I have had projects where I'll actually go to this first because it's about this particular thing. This was a project a couple of years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. I was asked to come and help code a bunch of 50 odd transcripts from sub-Saharan African country. It was a project about vaccination, and they're like, well, we don't have anyone who can, code these with the TDF or the theoretical domains framework. And I was like, yeah, cool, yeah, I know the TDF. Yep. I did, but not as intimately as I needed to code it. I very quickly got intimate with intimate knowledge of the theoretical domains framework when I tried to use it, because there was practically no guidelines, none whatsoever, on how to code transcripts practically in real life. What do you do when someone's utterance or phrase has 3 barriers in it? Okay, great. Well, we'll triple code it. We'll multi-code that sentence. But how do you then analyze it? No guidance whatsoever. And it required quite a lot of sort of professional creativity, shall we say, and experimentation, trial and error, and not experimentation, trial and error, to make it work so that this was done in vivo, and to quantifying some of that huge amount of qualitative data. It was not straightforward, and it was not obvious what to do with it, because that guidance still doesn't exist as far as I know. I've asked and don't know. But then it was really helpful to kind of give some clarity by things like, what types of barriers are really are a problem for pose a challenge for getting people to vaccinate their kids. And, you could see that, low income, suddenly you can kind of see the woods from the trees that, for example, in the bottom picture, if you look at it by income groups, look for low income audiences or groups, the psychological capability is the biggest barrier. Like, why should I do this? It was actually about why should I do this. But as you can see, even here, the psychological capability, you need to look into the detail afterwards, because it doesn't tell you if it's is it reminders or is it awareness. It doesn't tell you that. You still need to look a bit in more detail. So this really helped to kind of like give clarity of what the problem is. But it was really sort of like not just a one hiccup, but multiple potholes that you need to work through and kind of climb out of, really. One way that you can, this is my solution. This is not an official solution by any means. Sometimes if you're working on a more commercial project, you can layer the barriers, or like stagger them, I suppose, that you can think about, like, what are the core triggers for buying something or consumption, what's the fundamental need, and also where are the barriers, and put the barriers in these buckets. This you can read more on this. It's on my blog, but it's just a thought of an idea that you can put them in different stages. You can also combine it with journey mapping. There is an article about that by Ian Bucher and one of our colleagues, Jennifer. I've forgotten Jennifer's last name now, but you could do that, and that can be really helpful. And then here's and this last one is an example of how flexible COM-B can be to structure your thinking. So this project, the paper, the report isn't out yet. It should be out soon, but it's for a UK public sector body, and it was to look at the behaviors of businesses. And it kind of emerged halfway through into the project, so it wasn't quite obvious to us at the beginning that we're actually going to be looking at behavior of businesses, not humans. And by that point, we've said yes, COM-B and behavior change wheel are great. And then we're like, oops, okay, it's not really meant for analyzing business behaviors, but since we're here now, let's see if we can kind of make it, stretch it to kind of like, let's imagine a business as a human being, and let's see if we can use we can tailor or kind of adapt the dimensions to match. And we kind of, we did a job that the client was happy with, and he's familiar with the COM-B and behavior change wheel and Susan Mickey. So I'm assuming that I'm going to assume that it was okay. But it can really, this is just a sort of example of how you can like an intellectual stretch of the framework. And I kind of love it because it just shows how flexible the framework is. And there's no reason to assume that you can think of it, stretch it to something else. And there's a ton of tools, like I said. I just put some screenshots of things. I'll talk you through very quickly what they are. So there's obviously the behavior change wheel. There's a website and the book. It is worth having the book, I think. UCL also I don't exactly know what format they are these days, but they used to do a summer school, an advanced summer school, that really take you through a whole lot more that's in the BCW book. But because pandemic, because all the other stuff, I think they're revamping those to more accessible ones and not in-person boot camps anymore. But that'll be on the UCL Behavior Change website. You'll see some trainings there. There's also unlockingbehaviorchange.com, which is, I don't really know how it's all related to this, but it is by the same people. So there's a whole lot of interesting and useful resources there. It's very accessible, much more accessible than the Behavior Change Wheel book itself. You can kind of get away with that without it. There's so much on the Unlocking Behavior Change website. Then there's, if you want to do a course, thank goodness UCL have actually put together a more accessible course and in-person bootcamp. It's on FutureLearn, and I think it's brand new. So you can do that. And then there's also an unrelated Imperial College Coursera course that is about public health practice. They do talk about COM-B. And then you've got, if you already know a little bit about COM-B, afterwards you have the theory and technique tool, which is, if you saw the behavior change techniques and mechanisms of action, they have that whole grid of with the little colored squares. And then there's a BCT taxonomy. There's also an app for that. So that is a database of interventions where the interventions have been coded with the behavior change technique taxonomy. And that is really quite very, very detailed. But if you need to reference your, justify, rationales for choosing certain ones, or you want to see examples of how some behavior change technique has been used in certain domains, that's your place to go. And then there are a couple of papers on how to use a TDF, and there is no website for that, but that paper will help. You can also Google it. And then for the super advanced part, once you've worked through all of these, I'm still working my way through the Human Behavior Change Project website, which is it's a very, very exciting sort of initiative, and it will have the project resource page has a ton of papers and stuff on how they're really moving this thinking forward. And I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how that develops. But there is the information, if you're looking for more information on the mechanisms of action, that'll be on that site. And that's really it. I'm going to stop the slideshow, and I think we're ready for some questions.
That's amazing. Thank you. You've covered a lot of ground. That's incredible. Once I come to the questions, I'll just ask you a quick one. For everyone starting off and getting to grips with this model, are there any pitfalls any watch outs that you recommend, or any tips to help get everyone started?
Pitfalls. Well, pitfalls I would say is reading the first part, and thinking you kind of know it and you've got it now. We're not, this is not like predictably irrational, thinking fast and slow, that you read it and you think you know everything. It's really you have to, in order to really fully use COM-B and the behavior change wheel, you have to spend some time learning about, really thinking about and learning about and practicing using it. It's much more like, it's not a set of theoretical knowledge, is a tool. So I thought that I understood what I was saying, we need someone who knows the theoretical domains framework. I was like, yes, I know that. Yes, I know it. Yes. And it turns out when you actually start to use it and actively try to code transcripts, it turns out that knowledge was not really the problem. It was kind of like you have to very quickly retrieve and identify. It's almost like pattern recognition, that now when I read a sentence, I can kind of very quickly identify, yes, there's behavioral regulation, there's and you can kind of, then it becomes, it's like cycling, like learning to ride a bike or a car. At first you're like, remember to look behind you and do this and this, and then the more you use it, the more you use these tools, the more natural and more sort of automatic it becomes. So I think the pitfall is really reading a little bit and thinking that you know it, and that now we're kind of like, now I'm good, I don't need to know anymore. No, I've been using this for years, and there's still so much to kind of learn and understand, and it's that's really the pitfall. But the beauty is that if you are new into this, you can start where it's easier, and then as you feel more comfortable and competent with using the simpler end of the toolkit, then you can add to it bit by bit, and you're still doing pretty well if you harness the front bit. So I think that's pitfalls and also the benefit.
That's a good tip. So I'm going to cut to people that have their hands up. So Amanda, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to click allow to talk so you can call out your question.
There is also a question in the Q&A.
I think there's a couple in there. Amanda, did that work?
Yeah.
I think you're on.
But we can take in any. We'll take in any order you want to take it.
Okay, Amanda might not be talking. So we'll go to the one in the chat from Adam. Where does time to make the change fit, short or long term? Where do multiple behavioral changes fit? Most changes are a function of other small behavior change. How does that fit?
So where does time to make the change fit? Well, if I'm going to make a guess what you might mean. I think sometimes it's useful to combine COM-B with other theories, like things like theory of like stages of change. So where is someone on, are they in the maintenance phase, or are they in a kind of like off the top of my head, I cannot remember them right now. But so it can help to kind of think about where are they in that process. Most changes function as smaller behavior changes. Yes, but if you, in this case, when you're thinking about things from a COM-B perspective, you need to define the target behavior as precisely as you can. You may have other target behaviors. Your overall behavioral outcome that you're looking for might be comprised of several target behaviors, but you need to do the analysis separately for all of them. Now, the smaller behavior changes, that is, on the other hand, you can think of this the other way, that behavior change is a function of smaller changes. Yes, so the smaller changes are literally changes in capability, changes in opportunity, changes in motivation. So that's the other way of looking at it.
Fantastic.
I think.
There's a question from Matty. I think, Matty, if I remember that coming through, that was when the piano slide was up. Yeah. So here we're just looking at dopamine scheduling and how it changes contextually.
Maybe it's not necessarily like, not every behavior is going to be as pleasant as playing the piano, so it depends. It could be a grudge behavior as well. So it's just an easy example. I'm not going to get into like dopamine stuff. It's a different topic. Actually, for Jeff, yes, absolutely. Jeff's point is that challenge in terms of developing habits or possibly routines, because not every routine is going to be a habit, and nor does it need to be, is to sustain those things. You don't necessarily need to sustain the capability if it's an awareness one. It depends. Nor the opportunity, it depends. If sometimes it's a one-off change, but really, actually, what's beyond what you've kind of illustrated is what comes before COM-B is thinking about the characteristics of the behavior you're trying to change. Sometimes it is a one-off behavior. You don't need to think about long-term things. If it's a simple one-off behavior, then you don't need to think about that. If it's a long-term behavior change, yeah, it gets a lot more complex, of course, and complex behaviors with multiple steps, that too. But not every behavior we want to change is is something that you need to do continuously. Sometimes it is. There's actually a really interesting book that that Jeff, you might find interesting, might find useful here. I will look it up. I'll put it in chat, but let's ask our next question.
Okay, it's from Daniel, and it's around structured interviews. To what degree are we confident that people accurately understand and can articulate their COM components during structured interviews? Are there any other effective data collection methodologies you're seeing?
Yeah, so it is actually your job as the researcher to make sure that you don't just, not in some cases you can't just directly ask people, are you aware of this? Boom, 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 or things like that. They might not be. That's the skill of a qualitative researcher, for example, to set up the questions or ask the questions in a way or lead the conversation in a way that people will tell you their story and their articulation of their reality. You don't necessarily need to take everything they say at face value, but that is a qualitative researcher skill. You can also complement that with observation in some cases, if you can. It depends on the behavior, on the research you're able to do. You can also, there's all sorts of ways you can gather the information. You can look at existing behavioral data, for example. If it's something, how often people do something, is it that they forget, or they, whatever. So it's kind of, that's where that is actually one of those potholes that I showed, that it seems like a very straightforward thing. yes, until you try to, you know, actually work it out. But you need to do that process for yourself for every project. And I have had, so for example, in a quantitative questionnaire, I think some of the materials from UCL suggest, oh, you can put these, you know, these dimensions into conjoint. Sure, you can, but not everything, like you can't assess awareness necessarily, like, are you aware of this? But you know, but yeah, it's not always a question that people know how to answer. But that's a research skill, not combi question, really.
Great. And Jane, you've got your hand up, but do you want to type your question in the chat? And does anyone else want to type any questions in the chat?
Mm-hmm. There is also a question from oh yeah, was that question. Oh, and Amanda, of course. Amanda hasn't asked her question yet.
Yeah, I don't know if there's something wrong, because Amanda's able to call out a question. Or Amanda, can you type your question in the chat, perhaps? Maybe not. Questions are drying up. Then we'll thank you for your time. That was quite incredible. You covered a lot of ground, and I love how you built on it as well, from the simplicity of the combi, and then actually you can build all these theoreticals and take it to a more advanced stage. So that's fantastic to know that you can build on that. And then we will share the slides in the video. We'll post it in the LinkedIn group.
Yeah.
Sydney Behavioral Economics Network.
Yeah.
And
I'm just trying to think, where on earth was my I have this book, and I'm just trying to find where I have this book, but I will put them for I think it was, oh no, is there more no, for Jeff, I will put in an extra bit in at the end for this book, which I can't find right now in my folders, but I will put that in there. Oh, hi Natalie, hi. Just want to say hi. And that is a whole other, you know, you can spend a couple of weeks reading that, so that'll be fun. But I'll put that in there. So yeah, it was really my pleasure. I feel like a combi evangelist, because I'm really not, like, I'm not the expert in this. The UCL people are, but it is, you know, selfishly, I think there is a bit of selfish interest that the more people use combi, the more we can make that, like, you know, I don't know. I just think it's a very useful approach. So I'm very happy to kind of spread the good word of combi and behavior change, Bill. So thank you for inviting me.
No,
and yeah, and have a good evening. And yeah, I'll share the slides with you after, so you can put them up.
Fantastic. And I think it goes back to your first point about creating a similar language for everyone to use. So glad you're evangelizing and spreading the gospel.
Yeah.
As well. So thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.